Good afternoon, everybody. If you would take your seats. My name is Sean Fitzgerald. I'm the director of the Centre for Climate Repair, and it's a very, very great pleasure and a privilege to be introducing this afternoon's speaker, who's Professor Paul Monks from the University of Leicester. Paul was until very recently the Chief Scientific Advisor for the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. And I got to know Paul through his role there. Actually, when we first met, it was in those terrible times of COVID. And actually, Paul walked into this mess we were trying to navigate ourselves through, but did a masterful job at helping those government departments sort of help figure out what the right way forward is. But over the last few years, I've had some fascinating conversations with Paul and shared some of my concerns and maybe frustrations with just the lack of progress for tackling climate change. And I've been to the COPs since Glasgow, so that was COP26. And to be honest, I haven't seen an enormous amount of progress on actually tackling the problem of climate change. So Paul is going to share with us this afternoon some of his thoughts regarding actually what the right way, do we need to rethink the way that we tackle climate change, and say with his experience from not just as an academic, but actually having spent 5 years learning and then helping influence the way that government and government departments in particular sort of help navigate this with regards to policy. I think we're in very good hands. So Paul, thank you ever so much indeed. Over to you.
Thank you Sean, for that very kind introduction, and you've kind of given it away. We're going to talk a little bit about some musings on the way that we need to think about maybe changing the way that we address climate change. So a disclaimer, this is not an advert for Leicester Comedy Festival. If you've ever been to a comedy festival, people give talks there where they say it's a work in progress. So my thinking on this is really a work in progress. So I've not come here to give you a seminar where I'm going to stand up and give you all the solutions. Actually, I'm hoping that we'll have time at the end to have a discourse around some of the ideas that I'm putting forward here, but it's very much a work in progress as part of this. So the TLDR of this, of course, to the question is the following. Yes, of course, we do need to change the way, as Sean has eloquently said in the introduction, it's kind of not working. And therefore we need to do. So if you want to go now, you know the end of the talk, because you know the end of the question, the answer to the question. So let's frame it a little bit. And I guess I come from this sort of position. The greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it. And I think that's an incredibly interesting kind of quote to think about. A guy called Robert Swan said this around 2009. I think the danger of this, as starting in an engineering department, is I've already started with a slightly emotive quote. And I want to kind of roll back a little bit on that and think about what are the different aspects that we need in order to deliver climate change and climate change action based on our best understanding of the science and engineering, etc. So I'm going to take climate change absolutely as read. I'm going to say that nobody in this room is going to want to really get into a long discourse on that. I'll just quote the IPCC on AR6. We kind of know the physics of it. We kind of know what the impacts of it. And you know, it's really unequivocal. So I'm going to take that absolutely as read as part of this. I'm going to initially focus on emissions of greenhouse gases. Just as a starter, I think what we'll find as we kind of go through some of the ideas in this is that that's a challenge. If we really want to mitigate climate change, that's quite a challenge. On the left-hand side is a graph that you'll have seen in various forms, which is going back to the 1950s and the growth to the 2020s in terms of the global emissions. And I found this wonderful map online here, which is the area of annual CO2 emissions. The area of each of these countries is proportional to the annual CO2 emissions. And actually, I could stare at it for hours because it's actually in many respects quite frightening. You know, if you look to the future, you barely can see Africa or South America. And if you think about the amount of economic growth that's going to go on in both those regions and the populations of those sort of regions, yet they're not really figuring in the CO2 emissions list. This only runs up to about 2016 from memory. But you'll also see the massive growth in China towards the end of that sort of period. Here's it in 1970s and the growth there on the right. And I think one of the most amazing graphs that I've ever seen, right, is the amount of coal usage in China. If you go to World in Data and you look at the amount of coal usage in China, it is one of the most frightening graphs I have ever seen. You know, it's like a logarithmic growth. Now it's topped out, that's the good news. But you know, I think another part of this, when I look at this, you know, what we're talking about here, tons of CO2 in billions. You know, those are, frankly, very large numbers. You know, and I think we struggle to articulate the size of the challenge in order to do this. So if you look at the UK by GDP is about 1% of global emissions. You know, but you can see some of the challenge. So the part I'm going to start with in this is, well, let's think a little bit about emissions. The main push is to reduce that, and we'll see where that kind of runs into trouble, and you know, some of the things we need to think about when we do that. So here is the challenge. This is my favourite quote, which I took as a picture off a door of a colleague. And this is a chap called H.L. Mencken, and he said, for every complex problem, there's an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And I hope today that I'm not going to fall into that trap. I try and take a complex problem and trying to give you a simple answer. Because frankly, if climate change was simple, we would have solved it. The whole reason why it's so challenging is that it's not simple to solve. Now, you know, it's a self-evident statement, but you know, it's a good way of thinking about it. So let's have a now, if we're going to produce this new blueprint, let's have a kind of think about what some of the characteristics of this problem are. So I'm in an engineering department, so you all recognise what this is. It's a systems diagram. You can all see it's a systems diagram because it has lots of lines on it. Some of them are thicker, some of them are thin, and it is completely incomprehensible, so therefore it must be a systems diagram. This is actually a systems diagram for the decarbonisation of energy. So you've got the energy sources on the left there, gas, electricity, oil and petroleum. You've got the usage sectors on the right, and these are some of the changes as you maybe want to move from natural gas to hydrogen. Let's not get into that too detailed, or the balance against oil and gas, the electrification, etc. On the right hand side, the usage sectors. So we classically, and we do know, and the reason why this isn't a simple problem is that it's a systems problem. That's why it isn't that easy to solve. But it's more than that, and it shows the three more things on this graph. We treat this problem often as a technocratic problem. We'll solve this if we just deploy the right technology. Bill Gates said in his 3 tough truths, you know, what we should just do is stop now and hope technology rides over the horizon to save us all. That will not happen. So there's 2 other aspects of this. You can see on the right-hand side, this system links to the consumer behaviour and behaviour change. This is a social problem as well. You know, people use technology. Technology doesn't use itself. You know, if we think about some of the big shifts that we're looking for, you know, the move to EV cars, that's as much that the EV car is there, but it's also that the consumer wants to use that EV car. So it's a socio-technical problem as well. The third part of this is that it's also an economic problem. We need the money to do this. So it's a socio-economic and technical problem. So it's a system of systems problem. So it's not even just a 1-system problem, it's a 3-system problem. Now, I've just framed that in the UK context, and I think it then also has to sit in the global context. It's got to sit in the global energy transition context and also the global economic context as well. So it's a system of systems. It's 5 systems all interacting with each other. Now you get the idea of why it's complicated. Because actually not only do we have to solve it for ourselves and optimize our system and the way that we do that, we've got to be able to interface that into a global context, and it's got to be a social, economic and technical interface into that global context. So that's why, in some senses, it's so hard. I think of it, on the other hand, back to H.L. Mencken, it's a 3-legged stool problem. We love in environmental science, we love three-legged stool problems. So in a way, unless we get the social, technical and the economic together and get them rightly balanced, it will fall over. So in a way, think of it as a three-legged stool problem in order to drive that systems approach, in order to deliver the systems outcomes that we need in order to reach the challenges of climate change. I often call this the everything, everywhere, all at once problem. Because actually what you're trying to do is you're trying to solve a system in real time, everywhere across the globe, and you're trying to solve and change everything at the same time. So, you know, it is sometimes kind of slightly mind-boggling because it is really an everything, everywhere, all at once problem. So I think that's worth thinking about in the context of this. So, that's great, you know, so it's a hard problem, it's complicated, there's lots of systems. How do we go about this? I'm going to kind of jump to the end and kind of work backwards in some senses. I'm going to start with where we are today. So how do we measure progress? So I'm going to talk a little bit about carbon budgets, net zero and the Climate Change Act, because that's the UK context. That's the way that we've decided in some senses to solve that systems problem. And it's worth saying after Glasgow and COP26, I think more than half the countries in the world have set net zero targets, if not delivering them through the sort of mechanism that I'm going to talk you through now. So let's think about how we can think about delivering and measuring progress and measuring outcomes. For those of you not familiar with net zero, just in case anybody isn't in this room, what you do is you balance the emissions that go into the atmosphere by removal. And we'll get very interestingly, and I feel very kind of exposed coming to the climate repair crew to talk about net zero. It's very important that they're netting that, not just the zero. So it's balancing the emissions that are going into the atmosphere with those taking out. And we actually might in the long term need to make that net negative in the longer term as well, to remove stuff that we've already put in there. So the balance of greenhouse gases produced and removed from the atmosphere is that balance between the two. There's a very interesting question there about whether that's an instantaneous balance or a long-term balance that's worth kind of holding in your mind. So let's have a look at some emissions, just to kind of get into this is the UK emissions up to a couple of years ago. We put out in the order of 385 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's including methane and nitrous oxide and gases like that. In terms of the major emission sectors there, about a third it comes from domestic transport, about 20% from buildings, 14% from industry, 5% from waste, 12% from agriculture and land use change, and electricity supply and fuel is about 20% as well, 18-19%. And this is the classical way that we report it, and this is a global way of reporting it. But have a look at the trends, actually. It's quite interesting to have a look at some of the trends. What you can see, actually, is a sharp decline in power emissions. And I'll come back to that a bit later. But you know, we were a country driven into the Industrial Revolution by coal, and we're the first G7 country no longer to be producing any of the power that's used in this room from coal-fired power stations. September, a year and a half ago now, was the last one was turned off in Ratcliffe-upon-Soar in Nottinghamshire as part of that. You can see, and interestingly, in terms of the waste, you can see how recycling and composting has nearly halved the amount of emissions that come from that area, and that's an area of success. But you will note, for instance, like domestic transport is very, very flat. Very, very flat indeed. You could just see the COVID dips, the COVID dip there from that. So we can learn a lot from the emissions and the way that they're distributed and what their trends are over time in the UK, and they tell you a lot about the effectiveness of policy as well. It's very much driven by the Climate Change Act. The Climate Change Act was originally brought in 2008, then was amended in Theresa May's government in 2019, and that was that by 2050 we'll have reduced our net emissions by 100% compared to 1990 levels. That's the base year. That's the base year of the Climate Change Act, 1990 levels. And we do that through a series of carbon budgets. They're 5-year budgets that are set 12 years before they have to go. So this year, we will set the 7th carbon budget. That has to be done, I think, by July this year through that. We've got the 5th and the 6th. So the 7th carbon budget runs between 2038 and 2042. We use those carbon budgets also as part of what I call our nationally determined contributions, which we then feed up into the COP process. So our NDC 2035 is a 81% reduction compared to 1990 levels. Should we just say a slightly challenging number as part of this? So what you can take away from here, we have a legal framework. We legally have to reduce our emissions. We do it in 5-year budgets. The government has to have a credible plan, in the words of the Climate Change Act, in order to be able to deliver that. This is what actually it is. I don't know why I put this slide in. It's just a lot of words. 5-year duration. It's a net carbon accounting, set 12 years. I've already told you that. The Climate Change Committee, the most misnamed committee of all time, because they're not really a committee, are actually the police people of this. They provide advice to the government on the size of the carbon budgets, and then hold the government to account about how well they're rolling those out. It's quite difficult to change carbon budgets. There's a very, very high bar for alteration, but there is complete flexibility in how you achieve them. That's not legislated in any way. It's the government to come up with a credible plan by mixing and matching all the different ways that it could do that. And if you think about this, this is our territorial emissions from 1850 to 2050. I've just put on the end here the carbon budgets, and you can see them. This is carbon budget 6 here. Carbon budget 6 is interestingly is the first carbon budget that was set towards net zero. Because if you remember, I said until 2018, they're all set to 80% by 2050. So carbon budget 6 is the first what's called net zero compliant carbon budget, the first one to try and drive it to zero. These are our emissions in megatons of carbon equivalent. You see we reached a peak just under 900 megatons, and now we're where are we now? We're just at this sort of level here. Current emissions are similar to levels in the early 1800s, when the UK's population was then half of the levels seen today. So actually, we have actually done quite well. We have halved it. And if we get to CB6, the last time emissions were low as a level to meet CB6 was 1853, was just 16 years into Queen Victoria's reign. So that's a challenge that we're trying to do. So with a population which is probably 3 or 4 times bigger, we're going to have carbon emissions that are as low as the Victorian reign by the end of carbon budget 6. That's the sort of plan. These are the historical emissions in black. Then the official data, which is called the inventory data, which is what we report internationally, is the stuff in blue, and the green is the projection forward from that. So that's how carbon budgets fit together. That's how they drive carbon, and you estimate how much carbon has been emitted down to zero. Even though I'll go on to say there are some real challenges with carbon budgeting and emission budgeting in particular, the part of the problem is it's really entrenched in the system. It's very ingrained in the system. And that's part of the challenge of trying to think about different ways of doing it. Just to give you a flavour of the carbon budgets, carbon budget 6 will mean a 77% reduction on 1990 levels. Now, those of you who are very, very all over this will have noticed that I said the NDC for 2035 was 81%. That's because the NDCs account for slightly different groups of emissions than what are in carbon budgets. And it's what you do in terms of what's in and what's out, particularly to do with what's called extraterritorial emissions, that give you a slightly different number. You'll notice, for instance, that international aviation and shipping is now included in carbon budget 6. It's the first one that's included that, for example. And that will take us down as far as we can see. So that's just to kind of give you the numbers. And you can see that we have met carbon budget 3, which was a couple of years ago. We are well on our way to achieving carbon budget 4. We are thinking that we shall achieve carbon budget 5, but carbon budget 6 at the moment is looking quite challenging in terms of that sort of shortfall. I'm happy to discuss about that if you are interested. So how do we achieve these carbon budgets? This is a graph taken from the Climate Change Committee, from their advice actually on carbon budget 7, which is called the Balanced Pathway at the end of 2025. And I don't really want you to probably spend too much time, but this is kind of the heart of how you do it. So the top two in purple is you reduce demand and increase efficiency. As I say, the cleanest electrons are the electrons you never have to produce. And we kind of forget about the demand, that we can reduce demand or we can increase the efficiency of the way that we use carbon. I think that's the easiest way. Then we can see the big slog of this, and all those kind of yellowy and orange colours come from electrification. Electrification is a very, very efficient way. As engineers, you should appreciate this. It's a very efficient way of being able to handle carbon. It's far more efficient than gas burning and the like. So if we can move to EVs, heat pumps, etc., they're low. A smaller bit, and this is in this carbon budget advice, is less for hydrogen, CCS and SAF going to 2050. So sorry, hydrogen, CCS is carbon capture and storage, and SAF is sustainable aircraft fuels, which are a slight misnomer, but we'll get to that maybe a bit later. Then in the green are the nature-based removals, and then in the black are the engineered removals, the GGR removals, the greenhouse gas removals. So that's where your net is coming from. At the bottom of net zero is the combination of the nature-based removals and the engineered removals in that carbon budgeting sort of sphere. And you can see that is in the order of 70, 80 megatons per annum. So that's quite a lot. That's quite a lot as part of this. So when I'm talking about achieving net zero and the ways to do it, these are the ways that you can do it. So what's the problems with those carbon budgets? They tend to only focus on carbon. This is an example from cement. Cement puts out 2.8 billion tonnes, 8% of the global emissions, greater than the US and China in terms of emissions globally. In terms of, I'll come from cement. Cambridge is very famous in cement research. You have some of the leading cementologists, is that the word I'm looking for, in terms of low carbon cement. The challenge of it, and I think often the challenge of carbon policy is, in order to reduce this sort of problem down to something that we can solve, we tend to only focus on the carbon savings. So this says, well, actually, we'll forget all of it. If we talk about cement, oh yes, it's terrible to produce emissions, but they're also making the many of the deltas of the world sink by extracting sand at vast amounts to make that cement. And also they have real problems with land, energy consumption, land degradation, social equity, air and noise pollution. So one of the challenges of carbon budgets is that they only talk about carbon. You know, it's very narrow vision. The second bit, and I'm parroting here Dieter Helm, who's an Oxford economist, and he says we're never going to get this to work if you think about only production-based things. One of the reasons that we will probably meet carbon budget 5, and I know this has been videoed, so I'll be careful what I say, is likely because we have offshored much of our steel production to other countries. You know, and we can talk about scope 3 emissions, and I know Cambridge is doing some really good work on scope 3 emissions and using AI to detect where scope 3 emissions are, but there are some real challenges. If all we do is we reach our carbon budgets by just offshoring that carbon to another country, that's not going to work. So he's argued quite strongly that we're not solving the problem, we're just simply moving it elsewhere in the system. We've got to move away from production-based ways of doing it, where you've got emissions with national borders, to the total footprint of goods in use, and we'd call that embedded carbon. And I think that I'm not actually the greatest Dieter Helm fan in all the detail, but I think he's challenging us here to say we actually have a system that's really not working for us, because if all we do is we reach our carbon budgets, we clap our hands, the rest of the world is still producing that carbon. So I think we've got to have a better way of doing that. So you get actually to border carbon taxes, CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and the ETS, the Emissions Trading Scheme. Both are critical. And when I come back to the policy bit a little later, I think that comes important. And I won't go through all his arguments, but there's some very interesting ones there as well. So we need, in a way, to make our budgets more deliverable. So we need, in my mind, to think a little bit about the spatial and temporal granularity of those budgets. The advantage I said at the beginning is that we have total freedom over them. You can see that An example is the Grangemouth refinery. We probably are going to need the Grangemouth refinery, but the problem is we need it in 7 years' time when those low carbon products are the products that we need in our system, and therefore we don't need them today. You know, much of the question about the North Sea transition, what is the right time and right place for that, come into that sort of piece. We need to think a little bit about how that links to fiscal and treasury rules. Some of the slightly bizarre outcomes that come from carbon budgeting are actually driven by that. We need to understand how technology adaptation, we're looking 10 years into the future, 15 years into the future. The technology is going to change. And I'm not going to say about AI adoption, I'm not talking about data centers. You know, everybody talks about AI and then wants to talk about energy and data centers. Yeah, okay, it's going to be an issue, but you know, you've just got to create more energy. I think AI is going to change our landscape quite markedly in terms of the way that we consume carbon, you know, and it moves around the system. And I think we also need to get the uncertainties down as the numbers get smaller. We also need to avoid a disorderly transition. If this is a social, economic and technical problem, the problem really with carbon budgets is they're very technocratic. They're very technocratic. 65% of the measures to achieve carbon budget 6 involve people as part of it. You know, so it's quite important that people have got to be part of it. So it's got to fit within our wider economic and social policy. If it just becomes that tunnel vision that I showed you, we won't be able to achieve it. So we need to have a systems way of thinking about our policy as well, in the way it sits in the wider policy, because we treat carbon budgets and we treat carbon and climate on its own, we will fail. So I've said some of that. So my conclusion is, can we make carbon budgets less technocratic in my blueprint? Can we reprofile them? Can we take a macro sector view? There are some non-CO2 blind spots in that. If this is about, at the end of the day, stopping global warming, we should do with non-CO2 emissions as well, because we want to reduce temperature, don't we? That's what we want to do. That's the failure of just looking at emissions as well. So we could be looking at easy wins around aircraft contrails, for example. So I think there's a danger with the budget piece that we get into these emissions blind spots, as I call them, as well. Right, so that's how we measure it all. The conclusion is we probably need to do better, and we need to think of it in a slightly different way. So let's now have a look at some other areas of this problem. I'm going to talk a little bit about energy and security. And in a way, I want to take the ideas that I just developed in that last bit and said, well, actually, we need to think about this in the wider context. Can we do it better? So let's have a look at energy. Anybody familiar with energy will know the energy trilemma. Any time when it comes to energy, we're trying to have secure energy, affordable energy, and sustainable energy. So it's another three-legged stool, but I decided not to draw a three-legged stool. It's colloquially called the energy trilemma. But any time, and actually, you know, with the global events and the geopolitical events that are taking place at the moment, this is actually sharply in focus, isn't it? Sharply in focus again, since the kind of terrible things with the Russia-Ukraine as well. So we're trying to ensure that we have secure energy, we're trying to make it sustainable, and we're trying to affordable. Energy is incredible. You know, I'm now going to switch from energy to talking about electricity. Do forgive me when I switch between the two. It's an amazing service. They deliver 99.49% reliability. That, I think, is absolutely incredible as a service. So in a way, in my net zero world, though, we've got a very different challenge as we get towards my net zero world. In a way, in my net zero world, we've got to have the correct production, storage, and use that delivers that net zero energy system. And what you can see here is there are multiple energy vectors in my world. So I'm not just talking about the phrase is green electrons, and for those of you that get offended by that, I know electrons don't have colour, you know, but everybody talks about green electrons. You know, so those produced from low carbon power. We're also, you know, likely to have some amount of hydrogen in the system, as I showed you from that previous CCC graph. We've also got the question about liquid fuels there as well as things like ammonia and CO2 storage as well. So we've got a much more complex mixture in our future energy system. And partly, this is another systems problem. There's another systems optimization problem as well. But at any given time, we've got to make sure that our system of the future allows secure, sustainable, and affordable energy, because they're the three things that you're trying to achieve at any given time. And if you look at the amount of now from energy to electricity, if you look at the electricity production over the last decade to 2020, from 2009, what you can see is some of the things that you've seen before. You see coal, virtually nothing. You'll see most of that is being picked up by gas. You'll see the growth of renewables and the increase in nuclear. And we had an 18%, 61 terawatt hours reduction in the amount of electricity that we generated over that period of time. Again, partly because electrification drives that efficiency piece. And this I find amazing graph, and you'll notice this is the coal emissions graph. You'll notice that if you go back to the territorial emissions graph, it looks very, very similar. Because of course, so the bulk of the territorial emissions back since the 1800s, the dominant CO2 source has actually been coal. So it is quite incredible that actually, just a couple of years, well, a year and a half ago, we turned that off. I still find that absolutely amazing. If we look at the amount of electricity that we're producing, I wrote this talk, I took this on Thursday, I have looked today, actually I looked with Sean at lunchtime. This is where our electricity at 5 to 4 last Thursday was coming from. About a third from fossil fuels, about a third from renewables and solar and wind, about 16% then from nuclear, biomass is DRAX, and then we're importing about 13% from Europe, and you'll see there we have France, that's mainly the French nuclear fleet, and Norway, which is mainly Norwegian hydro. So it's actually quite low carbon energy that we tend to import. We're exporting as well at that stage, particularly to Ireland, which is very dependent on exports from the UK. And I have a great app, which I really enjoy looking at, which is which wind farms are producing which amount of energy. And you can have a look at how much is then therefore being curtailed north-south. So often Hornsea 1, not very far from here, is one of the biggest producers. I mean, these are wind farms that have capacities of 1.2 gigawatts. That's a phenomenal amount of energy. If you think that today, at the moment, we're using about 40 gigawatts of energy, of which we're generating about 34, 35 gigawatts of that. So I mean, energy and electricity absolutely make the carbon market go round, so to speak. So I did want to make the point that the right sizing of electrification is absolutely critical. Much of the argument that we're getting at the moment is the one about do we build infrastructure for peak wind or not? And how do we get the efficiency, and how do we get the amount of storage that we need in the system as part of that? That's just kind of my energy sideline. I'm fascinated by energy and the things that go with it. Why do I want to talk a little bit about energy? I want to kind of return to the theme of this talk and talk about the Clean Power 2030 plan, which you may or may not have heard of. It's one of the this current government's key goals as part of its 5 missions that it's trying to deliver. Clean Power 2030 says we want to achieve a 95% low carbon electricity system by 2030, reducing intensity to be 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. And in the Labour Party manifesto 2024, and I'm not trying to make a political point here, other political parties are available, but they said the climate and nature crisis is the greatest long-term global challenge that we face. The clean energy transition represents a huge opportunity to generate growth, tackle the cost of living crisis, and make Britain energy independent once again. Now, what you'll notice on that is it's a version of the energy trilemma, isn't it? It's a version of the energy trilemma that's trying to grow it. And what they've done is they've laid out their plans, the mixture of solar, PV, onshore wind, a little bit of hydrogen, a little bit of battery storage as well in order to take the peak off in the afternoon, and looked at, these are all the numbers in terms of gigawatts, in terms of generation capacity that we're going to need, as well as the flexibility that you're going to need to, so that's that sort of efficiency and piece that you get at the beginning. You've got to be able to save 2.5 gigawatts, which you could do by turning off. And if you don't know, the most expensive half hour of electricity is 5:30 to 6 o'clock every evening. So never charge your electric car during that half hour. So if you look at the Clean Energy Action Plan, which came out in December 2024, what it does, it changes a narrative. So this is, for me, an example of how you kind of change the tone. It says climate change is the imperative for action, but energy security is really important, because actually if you have your own, what I'm going to call indigenous production of energy, it's going to be quite good. and we'll use the industrial strategy because we want to get that economic benefit to the UK. So you change the policy framework and you say that the energy transition is not simply about reducing emissions, but it's about renegotiating the foundation of economic stability, national security, and the social context. So take those as words, they're political words. But what I'm trying to say to you is, well, here is a way of delivering climate change, but by using other imperatives alongside that, economic imperatives, security imperatives, that allow you to do that. So we can reframe the climate problem into a political context of something that we can deliver in 5 years. It's just an example of how the current Labour government are doing it. Again, I'm not trying to make a political point. I think there's a point just, can we learn and can we use this sort of methodology to help us reframe the climate change problem? As I've said, people are key to this. This is a graph that many of you, if you're familiar with the world of climate change and climate change communication, might be familiar with. This is a study from the US called the Six Americas over the last decade. And what it's looked at is the way that people feel about climate change, from those at the top that are alarmed to those that are dismissive at the bottom. And this is the decade 2014 to 2024. And what you can see over that period of time is the number of people that are alarmed has gone up quite markedly, and there's a bit of a swapping around of those that are concerned and cautious as well. The other thing to take from this is not a polar argument. The other thing that I think, which is quite interesting, that if you think about the dismissive and doubtful, which are here 22% of the people, if you will, whereas you've got well over 50% here of people who are either concerned or alarmed. Very much these sort of views tend to be overrepresented in political spaces. And I think when you look at polling and you look at how people are genuinely concerned about it, but much of the rhetoric and the noise comes from that. I think so. Understanding if we're going to have this different way of doing it in a new blueprint, I think we've got to pick up some of those elements and recognise that there is this quite large majority that are quite concerned about it, and finding them and giving them a voice. Just to show you a way of doing that, some work I did with the British Academy when I was in government was to think a little bit about how to underpin what is called the public participation strategy. I won't read out that, but it has 3 goals and it has 5 principles. I think at the end of the day, it probably isn't strong enough. There's still the climate push problem, that people do the right thing if you tell them it's the right choice. I'm not convinced that is the right way forward. I think it's very interesting when you look at things like the electric vehicle mandate, where you won't be able to buy a new internal combustion engine car after 2035. That sort of takes people on that journey in a slightly different way. So I think we need to, though, but I want to make absolutely the point that on my 3-legged stool, we've got to have the people in there as well. And people are actually one of the biggest forces for change in there. And I would argue, if you look at much of the polling on this and much of the statistics on this, then indeed, that's what politicians listen to as part of this as well. So we need, in my view, a more human-centred approach to this that is more places and persons. And this is the point to remind myself that actually we also need to adapt. I've talked a lot about mitigation today, and I'll carry on now, having paid my kind of homily to adaptation. We've already got over 1.5 degrees of climate change baked in. It is going to change the place that we live. Therefore, place and people are really important, and we've got to also put the resilience and adaptation alongside the climate change piece as well. Right, let's have a look at what science can do to help us solve some of this. Addressing climate change will require significant advances in innovation. About 35% of the emission reductions needed to enable net zero CO2 emissions globally still rely on technologies not yet demonstrated at commercial scale. So there's plenty for you guys in the room to do over the next period of time. I, in government, laid out a plan in the near term called the Areas of Research Interest for the Clean Energy Superpower Mission, which talks about what the thematic areas of where you need to do that sort of research in the government space, in the UK space, and then set out some priority challenges, which I won't go into in detail. Other than I'm going to talk a little bit about this one here, because of the interest in the room here. where is that net of net zero going to come from? You've heard the phrase net zero, net zero, net zero, but we don't really talk about where that net of net zero is really going to come from. And that leads us into the subject of geoengineering. And geoengineering really falls into two sort of pieces, two main groups of methods: solar radiation management and carbon dioxide removal. So in carbon dioxide, we increase the net carbon sinks at a scale large enough to affect climate. That's the challenge of CDR, if you will. I'm not going to talk a lot about solar geoengineering other than to say it's a tool that we have in our toolbox. It's highly controversial and not loved by everybody, but I do feel that it is important that we do research on it, because one day somebody is going to ask us the question, when something changes, can we deploy these sort of things? And we've got to be able to give them an answer based on good science. I don't think personally anything good comes in the climate area of sticking your head in the sand, frankly. Nothing good comes of that, and I think we should know that by now. And yes, it's a difficult area, yes, it's a contentious area, but I think we've got to push that along with that. On the carbon dioxide removal side, we have got an array of things here. We've got the whole bunch of nature-based ones. I think the important things in there are things like how you do what's called the MRV, the monitoring, ratification, and verification. Are you actually drawing CO2 out? A guy came to me and said, I am going to make the ocean slightly more alkaline off St. Ives by pumping something alkaline into it. And I will save hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tons of carbon that you can pay me for. And I said, well, but if I do the calculation on that, I'll see a fractional change of 0.00001%. How do I measure that? Oh, don't worry about that. The carbon's going into the ocean. Yeah, that's what MRV and the problem with MRV is. You've got to be able to do that. The thing with technological-based removals is back to our economic challenge, in the sense that they're very expensive. It's nearly $1,000 a tonne at the moment to remove CO2 through direct air capture and the like. But this is for me one of the biggest areas that we have to push at. Where is the net of net zero going to come from? How do we get low-cost, effective negative emissions into the system? And in a way, when we look at this, it's absolutely got to be looked at in the terms of the economics of that innovation. So we look at it through our three lenses, because actually we've got to reduce the green premium. The green premium is the additional cost of choosing a low carbon technology over the high emitting conventional one. We often refer to that as the green premium. And actually, if you look now, solar and wind is actually cheaper than gas. So actually, it's got a negative green premium. It depends how you count it. I know Dieter Helm here would be screaming at me. Nuclear power is positive. The electric car is neutral to negative on lifetime costs, on lifetime carbon costs. Cement and green steel are not in any type, shape or form. So I think we've got to, look at it and when we look at innovation, we've got to look at it through that kind of people lens. We've got to look at it through that. We've got to look at it through that economic lens, as well as just concentrating on the technology as well. So we need to drive innovation. We need actually a systems approach to innovation as well. And you can see that's from an old strategy that I did a few years ago. And we need to drive that innovation. We need to reduce the green premium. So how do we do this in terms of policy? I've talked a lot about this. What is the political economy of the problem? And this is an Albert Einstein quote. We cannot solve today's problems with the same thought processes that created them. And I thought that's kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. Because a guy once said to me, I don't worry about the future. You'll all be able to create brilliant technologies for the future, and they'll work. What I worry about you is decommissioning the technologies today. And he wasn't just talking about decommissioning in terms of oil rigs and whatever. It's often the economic things that underpin it. It's actually why are fossil fuels so persistent? Because actually we've subsidised them for decades. So actually undoing some of that is quite hard. So maybe the problem in my blueprint is I'm just trying to solve the problems in front of me. I'm not thinking about I'm trying to think with the problems of today, not the solutions of tomorrow. So, you can look at the political economy of net zero, and net zero succeeds or fails based on political choices and economic incentives, not simply climate science. I think it's worth kind of recognising that, and these are some of the things that I've kind of mapped out that I won't go through now, but you can already begin to see are quite important in doing that. Politics is quite interesting. My experience of politics is very much like this. Politics are not a science. This is Otto von Bismarck, of course. He said politics are not a science based on logic, they're the capacity of always choosing each incident in constantly changing situations, the least harmful, the most useful. And that's definitely my experience of dealing with politics. You know, it is not rational. And if you think it's going to be rational, you will fail. If you're a scientist or an engineer, you know, it's not. We created politics because, you know, we've got to be able to trade off apples and oranges. You know, that's what politics does. You know, so don't apply scientific thinking to it, else you will fail. So there are ways of doing this. Apparently, you're not allowed to say killing two birds with one stone anymore because it's saying that you're going to kill birds. Apparently, according to PETA, it's feeding two birds with one scone, which I thought was quite good actually. So here you go. Let's have a think a little bit about. Can we do that wider piece? Can we wind that political economy piece? Can we look at co-benefits? Actually, we have had success in this sort of area. We go back to the 1950s and the Clean Air Act in air quality. We got public driving that. Actually, in as little as 4 years, we had change. So there are some, I haven't really got time to go into it, some really good learning from that. We've now got to get the policy mixture right. So we've got all the policy tools that I've mapped on the left-hand side here. There's a really good paper recently from Alicia Steffmeiser and a whole bunch of colleagues looking at how you then put these different policies together. And she says most climate policies do not work effectively on their own. They're more successful when they're combined with carbon pricing. And the right mix is what matters. And you can see what the rest of it is there. And actually, as I was thinking about this, returns us to the question of, well, actually, you know, my three-legged stool is my systems view of this. You actually have to take a systems view of policy as well. Because actually, I think much of the failure of climate policy, we've done it one policy at a time. Actually, what these sort of approaches show, and there's a growing literature on this now, is that you need a systems view of policy. It's the way those policies all interact with each other which drive down that green premium, which give you the most effective piece. I think it's quite interesting, though, that it actually, back to Dieter Helm earlier, and carbon border adjustment mechanisms and carbon taxes, that seems to be something that you have to underpin. You have to somehow stop the flows across the globe. You have to be able to stabilise those, else it's the only way to do economic balancing as part of that. You will notice that the developed economies in these different areas and the developing economies have very different sort of policy mixtures to deliver the same outcome. But we can often get these sort of win-win type policies, and you can see on there a whole bunch where you get a climate benefit, but also you get a co-benefit. And anything that leads to a health benefit is obviously massive. You tweak by 0.1% anything to do with health outcomes in the United Kingdom, you get massive financial savings, you know, as part of that. So I think we've got to look and think about, as I showed you with the Clean Energy Superpower mission, it's much about the co-benefits and the win-wins that come from this, and framing your climate policy in that wider sense that I think allows you to do this. We probably need to work better in the international context. I know, and I haven't got really time, I know that I'm running out of time and I want to stop, but I just wanted to make that comment in passing. Something's not working internationally and we probably need to do better. So, can short-term politics ever deliver long-term climate change action? That, I think, is the central conundrum when we come to think about this. And I think the answer to that probably is yes, but only if we have a better framing and understanding in the systems view. And that systems view is a systems view for, yes, the social, economic and technical, but also has a systems view of the way that we deal with the policy. So we do need a blueprint. It's got to sit in economic and social policy and not be tunnel vision on its own in order to deliver that. I've given you today some practical examples, I think, of the ways that can be delivered. So this is not just some kind of academic on a Monday afternoon in Cambridge saying, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if we just changed the whole system? No, there are practical ways to deliver that outcome, and there are good examples of the way that we have done it. So what do we end up with? It's only, well, I've said it, it's only when we work across that triumvirate we can deliver those long-term policy outcomes, but it's got to be embedded in that wider political economy. There are a number of different things that we need to include. I've talked about those as we've gone along. I don't think I've got that list right, which is back to this is my work in progress, and I don't think I've got everything that I need to put into that blueprint. But I think, to finish, the House of Climate Change is an untidy house. You know, this is one of my favourite diagrams. This is for the climate change building from a decade ago. Science is the basement. We've got the economy, society, the law and governance that comes together. We've got all these terrible things that are going on there. It still remains a challenge, but I do think we need to step back. We do need to reappraise and think about what a new blueprint is that embeds climate change in a more pragmatic, deliverable framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Right, could we have any questions from the audience? I was going to suggest we start with an early career researcher. Why don't we go with your good self, or a student at the first? I'll pass you the microphone so it gets recorded. And top tip, please, if we keep our questions short, and Paul, if we keep our answers short, it will allow us to get through as many as possible in the time we've got left.
Thanks so much, Professor Monks. That was a really fascinating session. My question is...
You know what? Nobody ever says you have to talk. That was a really crap talk you've just given.
Oh, no, that's okay. I'm actually a law student visiting here, and your conclusion is like something that really interested me, right? Because you said that what we need to do is to reframe the problem as an economic and social problem along with the technological problem. Yeah. But if we look back into international climate, politics and negotiations and law, that is how many would argue as the problem has always been framed from the developing world as an economic and social problem, and that has led to certain outcomes. Some we may argue to be equitable in terms of how the developing world has had more concessions in terms of the targets that they set, but it's also the very basis of the kind of pushback that we see from the right, because they frame it as a social and economic problem as well. I'm wondering, to add nuance to your conclusion, whether you have suggestions on how you can sort of build backstops to prevent retrograde from climate policies when we think of it as an economic and social problem.
Yeah. So you pointed to the biggest hole in my argument, and I kind of flashed past it when I said, this doesn't wholly work internationally. You know, because I think I would argue the COP process is exactly as the point of, in some senses, why it's mired, is exactly those issues of social equity and fairness. And why can't we, in inverted commas, have the same amount of carbon that you've had to develop your economies, in short? So I think that's sort of the analysis that the lady was doing in the science paper. Says there are different, and I think my only note of hope for you, in some senses, is that you shouldn't try to achieve net zero in the way that Western economies have done it. There's a different route which I think will lead to a different outcome. So I think part of the failure of imagination, if I could call it that, is to want to repeat the mistakes of those economies, where actually what NEO says and policy says is you've got to optimise it in a different way for your economic situation. And we can look to India, and we can look at, for example, Modi's push into hydrogen as an example of that, which may well work for India in a very different way because of the availability of solar energy. I'll stop there under the short thing, but I think there's a danger of trying to do it the same way, in short.
Hi, Paul. Given that China are due to bring a 95 gigawatt coal-fired power station online this year, isn't anything that we do completely futile?
No, so I don't think it is. I think if you look at China's coal consumption, it's about to turn over. I'm not sure it's 95 gigawatts. 95 gigawatts is it's 95 gigawatts of generation. It's not a single station, though.
Your slide said our power demand is 30 gigawatts in this country, so that's nearly 3 times.
40 gigawatts, yeah. They've got a population of 1.1 billion, though. We've got a population of 65 billion. So if we look to China, I think the positive I would put there is they've set a goal for 2075. Yes, they're building a lot of coal-fired power stations. I don't disagree with that. But they're also the biggest rollout of renewables in the world. They're bigger than us in renewables. And they're also bringing on large amounts of nuclear power than anybody else in the world. Why are the Chinese doing that? It's back to some of the arguments I was making. It's a co-benefit argument. The reason why they don't want, in inverted commas, more coal-fired power stations is because it decreases their air quality. And actually, in inverted commas, there's a health detriment that comes from building more coal-fired power stations in particular. So yes, there's a power need, and that's been driven by a short-term need to build it. But in the longer term, they're actually decarbonising, quite rapidly, partly because of the health co-benefit that comes along with that. Pardon?
It doesn't sound like they are.
They are.
Bring them a 95 gigawatt coal-fired.
Yeah, I mean, but it's regional, but they are actually. If you look at the amount of coal consumption in China, this year is the same as last year is the same as the year before because you account the year after. So that tells you, given that it's mostly primary energy generation, that tells you that's plateauing out, there is in my mind more to be positive about the Chinese situation than there is.
Why do they bring these coal-fired stations on when there's a premium?
Because they're quicker to build than either nuclear or solar. They've maxed out the market actually, but you get into slave labour then.
Let's take a question at the back. Andrew.
Yeah, Britain's got the highest industrial energy prices in the world, and so we used to make things and sell them to the world, and now everyone works in Wetherspoons and for the council, and we don't make anything. So the nature of our economy's changed, in general, but also because of those electricity prices. And has that really been factored into this discussion? And the second point that I wanted to make, which I think is really important, it's not really necessarily a correction, but it's a kind of a change in the way you describe it. It's all very well to say solar is the cheapest energy in the world, but it's only the cheapest energy in the world if you don't take into account transmission and storage and grid balancing and all the other costs. So I think when you take those two things particularly together, you get quite a different picture of what's really happening. I just wanted to draw you on that.
So you and Dieter Helm are one on this, on the second point, because you are right, you have to look at the system cost, the system cost. So it's wrong just to look at the generation cost. I didn't really go into that, but if you look at the LCOE, the levelized cost of electricity, which takes in alongside the system cost, alongside that, then alongside the transmission investment that's required as well, then actually these are still more competitive than gas. Solar and wind are more competitive than gas. The challenge of solar and wind is the variability / intermittency, and that then gets you to the storage question. So I think that does that. Two, we never build anything more. Our manufacturing is 9% of our GDP. 9%. The EU average is 11%. So yes, there's a feeling that we don't, but we do still manufacture at scale. It is undoubtedly true that the energy prices are a problem. That there's two ways to solve that. Part of the way is what's called gas thingy, price rebalancing. So our marginal cost is set by the gas price, the last asset that you use to generate the electricity in that hour. So it's gas, whatever, price rebalancing.
You know what you mean.
Yeah, so I think that's an important part, and that needs to change, because that will then actually drive down our system costs. We have actually, particularly in summer, many negative hours of electricity. So I think we have it. We just need to rejig our markets a bit. That's easier said than done, because you don't want anybody to kind of lose out from that. And you don't want to strand gas assets either, for various reasons. That's the orderly transition piece. So I think it is possible to do that. Now we get to the manufacturing piece. 1980s, this country made a conscious decision to move away from that into the finance sectors. We can debate. Every government since has had an industrial strategy to try and reverse that. I think we still need to think a little bit about whether we can reap some of the benefits from the high value manufacturing that comes from some of this green transition. And you can look to the floating offshore wind industry. Yes, some of those big manufacturers are outside the UK, but much of the actual prime work is done, like Blades in Hull, Vestas in the Isle of Wight. We are reaping some of the benefit from that. But it remains a challenge, and that green premium is the thing, and actually getting those industries of tomorrow into the UK. I think that's the right way, but it still needs a more orderly way of doing it, which is kind of what I'm arguing.
Right. Any more questions? We're just over the hour. So okay, I'll ask afterwards. Are you sure? Do you mind if we...
No, please do. Carry on afterwards.
Lectures and things like this. So, can I just borrow your...
Yes, thank you.
Great. So I want to thank Paul for actually coming based in Leicester, but actually, fortunately, we're able to nab Paul on a journey going to Leicester from further east than here. Paul, we're very, very grateful to you for giving up your time and sharing it with us. Some of your thoughts about actually how we might tackle climate change by rethinking actually some of the things that we've been discussing for the last 30 years on, and not doing very well about it as well. So really grateful to you. Lots of food for thought on how we might move forward. Thanks ever so much indeed.